Regulatory update. Auditing and compliance testing. It's time for a bird's-eye view on the latest updates in auditing and compliance testing. Let's get started. Moderated by Robert Summit, WH Partners. Stephen Ketterly, Wiggin. Simon Planzer, Planzer Law.
Good morning, all. Thank you all for being here. First of all, let me introduce a little bit more our panelists today. Next to me is Stephen from Wiggin from the UK. Where Wiggin is one of the main law firms in the UK which specializes in the gaming industry, has been advising numerous clients in the industry. Next is Simon from Planzer, from Zurich as well. Quite a strong firm advising clients in the technology and especially in the gaming industry. And then Giles Schembri from KPMG, who is obviously one of the partners there, assisting clients in various audits that they are faced on a day-to-day basis. And on that topic, I wanted to start saying that, well, gaming operators are faced from a number of audits. Nowadays, it seems like that they are constantly doing an audit one way or another. Once you get to a certain stage of a size of a company, you just have one team dedicated primarily just to do audits. And that obviously leads us to say, but how can the operators be approaching these things? What are their challenges in going into all these kind of audits? And I would like Giles to maybe start off about this topic.
Well, of course, a number of operators face different audits. So you start off when first you get your license with the systems audit, followed by a compliance audit. You can have your annual statutory financial statements audit, and a host of other audits, of course. The challenges, of course, faced by operators are varied. One area, of course, which is faced by operators is support from different functions. So if you have an AML compliance audit, of course, you need your legal department supporting your KYC team. So primarily, the support of management and of the different functions within the operations are very important.
Stephen, from your perspective, I'm sure you've been helping a lot of clients when they come faced with audits. What do you see as the main challenges from them when they are approached with a compliance audit coming from the KGC or from any other regulatory authority?
Well, I think the industry just has to resign to the fact that this is now a thing, all right? And
it's the reality.
It's come up in sort of regular kind of compliance work of the Gambling Commission in the UK, at least relatively recently, and now it's very high on their agenda. I think they've worked out, and I think the industry is now working out that you can't just have a snapshot every 2 or 3 years of assessing your systems. It needs to be done on an ongoing basis. So, as you rightly said, there's lots of different types of audit. And I think that the biggest challenge I think that we find with the industry is just really trying to get their heads around how to manage an audit, what the scope of it needs to be, who needs to be involved, what the deliverable needs to be, so therefore what the actual objective of that audit is, and then we get into things I think we're going to talk about later as to how deep, how regular, all that kind of thing. But I think that one thing we definitely see, and I think we're going to touch on a bit later again, is audit fulfills such an important role in assessing the quality of the policies and the procedures that an organization will have. And it's only within that sort of internal and indeed external reflection on how your policies are actually being implemented do you work out whether or not they are actually working properly. And the word that we see in gambling regulation all the time now is effectiveness. The regulator is putting it onto the industry to demonstrate that what they're doing is effective to manage whatever risk they happen to be trying to manage. And without that reflection on how your processes are working, I don't think you're going to be able to do that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Simon, I'm pretty sure you have the same situation. But have you seen any additional challenges apart from the ones that Giles and Stephen mentioned?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind when we look at this regulatory burden and also testing burden that, of course, the majority of operators don't hold 23 licenses globally as Stars Group does, as was mentioned earlier today. So probably most of the operators, also based here in Malta, are dealing with a few jurisdictions. Having said that, that means they, on a regular basis, will not have either the manpower or, let's say, necessarily the in-house expertise to deal with quite a big burden. So I think this is probably one of the key aspects where companies want to pay attention to. That's what I've observed. And what I've observed also in the industry is, I guess, some of the fines coming from the UK Gambling Commission when it comes to AML, but then also from other authorities when it's about player protection, have probably raised that awareness among operators that this is really an important issue and can be costly if it's not paid full attention.
Yes, the cost could be very high, as we've seen happening in this last year or so. And yeah, I totally agree that the challenge is from a particular perspective of who to be on the audit, the manpower that you need on the audit, and the target that you need to achieve from this audit. Sometimes the challenge that I see more evident is that the client is not aware of what the auditor is expecting from him. And most of the time, it results in giving information which is irrelevant to that particular situation, wasting time at the end of the day, and which might lead to opening some things which are not even relevant to what we are discussing at this stage.
It's true. Well, maybe, Robert, if you allow, in fairness, that's often the mistake from the regulator, actually. When the communication is not clear, it's not very clear what the regulator expects, then, of course, this becomes a compliance nightmare. And it was mentioned earlier by Jesper Svensson that communication was one of the good key factors with MGA here in Malta.
But I think that's got to be also driven by who the regulator is and what regulatory environment we're talking about. I mean, when you're talking about it from a perspective of financial auditing, or you're looking at it from a perspective of a Gambling Commission regulatory audit or a data protection audit, you've got different regulatory frameworks, some of which can be very prescriptive, with the requirements are really quite clear. Some can be more outcomes-based, which your audit will have to adapt to look at it through that lens. So you're not necessarily going to have the right answer. It's going to be more being able to demonstrate to the relevant regulator that you have a process to try and achieve that outcome, which may be different between, say, 3 different operators, but that's what you're auditing. So the audit will differ depending on the regulator.
Exactly, and I think what also Heathcliff was mentioning this morning, they lead to something more specific. They lead to an audit which is more specific to what the risk of that particular operator is facing. Is something that maybe this is a good opportunity that MJ is taking and a good way forward to tackle certain audits. So how can the operators actually be prepared for the audits? I mean, apart from knowing what they should be expecting to give to the auditor and to the authority asking them to be audited.
I mean, I'll answer it from the perspective of compliance audit, and then maybe we can go a bit broader. But I mean, it's notable that when an operator gets a notice that there's going to be some in-depth compliance assessment, there tends to be a bit of a panic at that point. In my experience, pretty much across the industry, regardless of the size of the operator. And they'll then reach out for some help from somebody, maybe us, maybe you, whoever. And part of that will be almost like conducting a little bit of a mini audit. But the issue with that is you have to just explain to them, listen, if there are going to be issues that we're going to identify, they're already baked into your systems. So it's more going into the process being forewarned, rather than necessarily going to be able to remedy anything. But what that indicates to me is that it needs to be an ongoing process. The idea of just having this reflection that I mentioned earlier on on a kind of an ad hoc basis is where these problems arise. And so, you're now seeing it being implored of the industry, as you already see baked into financial services, and in many ways the gambling industry is financial services 15 years ago, is this idea of having constant quality assurance and constant assessment of where you are. So how to prepare is to basically be prepared all the time. Don't just think, well, I have to prepare for an assessment, and that's when I begin to have my reflection. That's when problems tend to arise.
Yeah, because most of the time, then you're trying to give the best screenshot possible of your current situation, which does not necessarily reflect the ongoing business and how you're doing it on a long-term basis.
If I had to add, from a practical point of view, I think it's critical that there's constant communication. So if I had to take a statutory financial audit, that the auditors don't just turn up, once a year. Clearly, communication between what the auditor needs to be able to carry out a financial statement audit is important. Certain preparatory work can be done well before, the end of the year. For example, if, certain operators acquire a subsidiary or acquire intellectual property or acquire a business, certain, valuation work, certain sifting through the documents can be done well in advance during the year. Also, one of the difficulties faced by operators, and this is where, life for both the operator and the auditor can be made much simpler. Certain operators, of course, hinge on third-party platforms. So you could have an operator providing a B2C operation, but at the same time he receives, or piggybacks on a third-party platform to source the gaming software. As an auditor, of course, one cannot take as a given, the numbers that are being provided by the platform. So you need to audit that particular platform. Many a time we find that we come across, operators providing these sort of platforms being subject to multiple audits. So they would provide games to operator A, B, C, D, E, and therefore the individual auditors of operator A, B, C, D, and E would conduct at times multiple audits on the B2B operator. One solution would be for the B2B operator to have an audit of its internal control systems, which is in practical terms referred to as an ISA 3402 type 2 report, which would provide an opinion on the operating effectiveness of those controls run by the operator. And that would, of course, avoid the duplication of a B2B operator having multiple audits.
So practically, one would be relying on a third-party audit.
Yes.
For at least for that part of the financial audit of a B2C operator.
You come across this very much so in the financial services sector. As you explained, gaming is still catching up with the financial services sector, but that is the way ahead.
I mean, internal governance is a really good way of looking at that. And when one of the challenges of audit is who is the auditor, and you see the requirement from our Gambling Commission. They expect to see an internal audit team. They expect to see an external audit. I mean, from a compliance perspective, and that's kind of aping what you see in financial services already. The idea that it's not necessarily the same people marking their own homework, right? That's, again, where I think the regulators do see there being significant risk in the way in which the gambling industry is set up, is that they have not evolved enough to be able to build a system which allows there to be some sort of objective scrutiny of the decisions that are made. I mean, that's particularly evident in enforcement cases, where you find when you're advising on enforcement cases, you are working alongside the people that are the subject of some of the Commission's attention. And that, in financial services, often it'll be a completely different team which you'd be working with. The gambling industry is not the financial services industry. It's not as big, it's not as complex. And so maybe the resources, and maybe it would be overkill to expect it to have such processes. But the larger operators need proper internal audit processes. But I'm actually only seeing that begin to develop in the last couple of years, really.
Yes, but not all operators are big-sized operators. We have a lot of SMEs, a lot of startups. And they're still faced, once they got the license, with these multiple audits, from AML to data protection, to the financial, to the normal gaming audit. So isn't that too burdensome on operators this size? Or is it maybe lack of foresight from the startup to actually know when and to actually go into an industry and start off?
It's the latter.
Well, I guess you refer to the question whether we do face really over-auditing, right? And I guess in order to be precise, we probably have to distinguish between the regulatory side, technical testing, and the financial auditing. I'll be very happy to revisit the regulatory side momentarily, but to start with the technical side, one thing I would suggest is that often the burden is very high initially. You alluded to it before. I wonder how high it is, and if you look at all jurisdictions afterwards. And if you think about the policy goals that are behind it, we really take a step back and look at the policy goals, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Just to take transparency and fair gaming as a policy goal, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have a high regulatory burden in the beginning and then not to have proper follow-ups. So I kindly suggest to maybe shift the burden and make it a bit more equal over time. Because especially in the online gaming sphere, where we're talking about technology and constant game improvements, patches, updates, of course, we should wonder to which extent this can affect the outcome of the game. If it does not, in my view, it's not a big deal. If it can affect the outcome of the game, it should probably be tested on a regular basis.
I mean, I've had situations where an operator has had, they've had the commission say to them, what are you doing in terms of your internal audit? And their response back to me is, there are like 12 of us. We're all in the same room. It's not like we have masses of departments.
Of course.
So I'm sympathise with that. But I go back to the question, and I think, if you're going to get involved in a heavily regulated industry, it's not cheap to comply. And I think the cost of compliance is increasing all the time. I think in that kind of situation, there will need to be a reliance more on external audit, and that can be quite a broad, there's quite a broad church of providers of external audit. But I think that what's absolutely crucial with that is that the operator really understands what it is they need to do. Because I have seen people relying too much on external audit, and the external audit is not necessarily up to scratch itself. The problem with that is as soon as you then present that to the Gambling Commission, the whole kind of house of cards falls down.
If I can add, of course, the objectives, each audit has a different objective. Touching upon the financial statement audit, of course, is to provide, an opinion to the shareholders on the appropriateness of the preparation of financial statements. So that is one area. In doing so, of course, the auditor needs to consider a host of other, laws and regulations, because those alone could impinge on the ability of a company to continue as an ongoing operation. One area which Heathcliff this morning, touched upon was on, and this ties up also to the point you made, is of course to have certain audits focus on areas for improvement. And this, I think, the way forward. Certainly, full reliance on external audit cannot be done because the objective is different. Although a financial statement audit does, meet the needs of a variety of users of financial statements.
Just coming back maybe briefly to the technical side of things, in essence, what the auditing is supposed to do is really to provide evidence to the regulator that the operator is actually doing what the operator is supposed to do. And
Correct.
in the very end, it's about this, right? So, of course, what you just said momentarily would erode the whole system. If the external company is not up to the game, then this erodes the whole trust about it. So, of course, there's an immense relevance of also testing the testing bodies itself and that they are properly accredited. So that's the technical side. And then maybe looking at the financial side, We had recently an example, not in the gambling industry, that illustrates the importance of financial auditing to such an extent, and also illustrates to which extent it's important to do follow-ups. So the failure of Thomas Cook, the tour operator, caused thousands and thousands of people to strand at airports and not being able to enjoy their holidays as they should be doing. So that probably illustrates from another field that continued testing has a value, especially in the financial sector.
I mean, I think audit, but I mean this broad remit of audit, internal audit, ongoing quality assurance plays such an important role. But I definitely feel that operators are scared of it a bit, because particularly when there is the potential sword of enforcement feeling like it's perpetually hanging over you. The idea that an internal audit is going to create a document which is going to highlight the shortcomings seems to be a bit counterintuitive for people. Why would I do that? But as we were discussing before the session, where we see the problems really arising is, it's a really good way, if you look at the way that our Gambling Commission approaches compliance audits, a perfect demonstration of where the problems lie. They ask for operators to give them a whole load of their policies and procedures. So you give them that information, they spend a bit of time looking at that, and then they ask for access to certain player accounts. And what they're doing there is they're looking at, okay, what does your policies and procedures say, and then how does it actually work in practice? And you can come in as an external person and do that, and you can look at player accounts and go, okay, so your policies required you to do something there, so what did you do? And how did you record that decision? And that's what the Commission are looking for. And that's not rocket science. You could actually do that yourself and pick that up on an ongoing basis.
So, certainly, if I may, as an auditor, you need to do two things. First of all, follow the money. That's key. Secondly, you need to look beyond the horizon. So you need to consider, how a company is impacted from a VAT point of view, how a company is impacted from a regulatory point of view, AML, GDPR, cybersecurity, all these facets, of course, feed into a statutory audit. Because if one of these cornerstones, of course, falls apart, then, it's like a house of cards.
But of course, audit, compliance is never going to be perfect. If you had an audit that said everything's fine, the regulator wouldn't believe you. So, I mean, I think it's always going to identify certain things that need to improve, and that's the point of it. But I definitely think there needs to be a bit of a shift in the mindset from the industry away from audit being something which they need to fear, and seeing as actually something that in the long term is going to help.
Exactly. It's part of quality, the quality of an operator, also the type of auditor, or who has, as an auditor, of course, says much about an operator.
Yeah. So as a concluding remarks, but can we streamline maybe audits in a way that operators are not that much audited all the time on maybe the same things from different maybe authorities?
Yes, I promised to revisit the point of the regulatory audit side, and of course, that's really of major importance. Heathcliff Farrugia mentioned today regulatory convergence that is unfortunately still far ahead in Europe. But in that context, I would like actually to refer to a judgment that by now is about 10 years old, but should not be forgotten. In a remarkable judgment, the EFTA court, so the smaller sister court of the ECJ, did note that while mutual recognition did not apply in the gambling sector, a member state that would license gaming would have to take into due account the checks already done by the state of establishment and expressed it as a legal obligation. The ECJ didn't take that expressly up, but considering that there is a wide and lively judicial dialogue in Europe between courts, I think that is a point of major interest still nowadays.
Very well. And from you guys, any concluding remarks before we conclude the session?
Certainly, of course, from my end, I would like to see, operators consider the audit as part of their, control and quality control systems. Of course, they shouldn't be scared of auditors, but, work hand in hand with auditors as ultimately, it brings benefit to the company and to society in general.
Don't wait until you get a letter from the regulator giving you notice of your compliance assessment to then start looking at how your system's working. Do it all the time.
Perfect. Thanks a lot.